With just $3,000 in a secret savings account hidden beneath loose floorboards, Sandra Washington was counting down the days until she could disappear from her life in Chicago. But on a cold Tuesday evening at Murphy's Diner, a mysterious Korean man in an expensive suit would walk through the door and change everything she thought she knew about survival and salvation. At 24, Sandra balanced worn-out trays with endless double shifts. Her dreams of nursing school pushed further away with each paycheck that went toward rent and groceries. She was practical, determined, and painfully aware that every dollar mattered when you were building an escape fund from an abusive boyfriend. Her natural hair was styled in protective braids that framed her face beautifully, but tonight she wore foundation a shade too heavy, carefully applied to cover the yellowing bruise along her left cheekbone. The makeup felt thick and obvious under the diner's harsh fluorescent lights, but it was better than the questions that came with visible injuries. "I'm curious, what city are you watching from tonight? And do you think some people are naturally drawn to danger, or do dangerous situations just find them?" Sandra had been working at Murphy's Diner for 8 months, long enough to recognize every regular customer, every shift pattern, every way to maximize tips from the construction workers who came in after long days and the late-night crowd that wandered in smelling of cigarettes and cheap cologne. The diner itself was nothing special, just chipped linoleum floors, red vinyl booths with duct tape covering tiers, and a coffee machine that made sounds like it was dying. But it was honest work, and Sandra had learned to find dignity in serving others, even when her own life felt like it was falling apart piece by piece. The evening crowd was thinning out when he walked in. Sandra noticed him immediately because everything about him was wrong for Murphy's Diner. He was Korean, probably late 30s, dressed in a dark suit that looked like it cost more than Sandra made in 6 months. The fabric was so perfectly tailored it seemed molded to his tall, lean frame. His hair was styled with precise control, not a strand out of place despite the October wind outside. But it was his presence that made Sandra's stomach tighten with unease. He moved with the kind of controlled confidence that came from never having to worry about anything, ever. His dark eyes swept the diner's interior like he was cataloging every exit, every potential threat, every weakness in the room's security. Sandra grabbed a menu and approached his table, booth 7 in her section, her practiced smile firmly in place despite the way her pulse had quickened. Up close, she could see that his suit was charcoal gray with a subtle pattern woven through the fabric, and his shoes were Italian leather, polished to mirror brightness. Everything about him screamed wealth and power, but there was something else underneath that made her instinctively cautious. This was a man who was used to being obeyed without question. "What can I get you tonight?" Sandra asked, her voice steady and professional as she set the menu down in front of him. Her hands were careful not to shake, though something about this stranger made every nerve in her body stand at attention. "Coffee, black," he replied, his voice carrying just the hint of an accent that made each word sound deliberate and precise. His English was perfect, educated, but there was something formal about the way he spoke that suggested it wasn't his first language. He didn't look at the menu, didn't ask about specials or prices. His dark eyes stayed fixed on Sandra's face with an intensity that made her want to step back. "I'll get that right for you," Sandra said, taking the menu back. As she turned to walk away, she could feel his gaze following her every movement. It wasn't the crude staring she was used to from some customers, the kind that made her skin crawl and her temper flare. This was different, more calculating, like he was studying her for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. When Sandra returned with his coffee, she noticed that he hadn't touched his phone or looked around the diner. He had simply sat in perfect stillness, hands folded on the table, watching the front door like he was expecting someone. Or like he was making sure no one unexpected walked through it. "Here you go," Sandra said, setting the cup down carefully. The man, Kim Hyong Nam, though Sandra didn't know his name yet, lifted the cup to his lips with movements that were economical and precise. Everything about him suggested control, from the way he held the coffee cup to the way his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging details. "Thank you," he said simply, and Sandra felt dismissed. But as she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "You work hard." It wasn't a question, and Sandra wasn't sure how to respond. "Yes, sir, I do," she said finally, uncertain why this observation felt more like an evaluation than casual conversation. Kim studied her face for a long moment, and Sandra had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing things she hadn't meant to reveal. The foundation on her cheeks suddenly felt inadequate, and she fought the urge to touch the tender spot where Marcus had backhanded her 2 nights ago for questioning where he spent his evenings. "How long have you worked here?" Kim asked, his tone conversational, but his eyes sharp with interest. "About 8 months," Sandra replied, wondering why this well-dressed stranger was making small talk with a diner waitress. Usually men in expensive suits were either lost or slumming, and they treated service workers like furniture. "School," he observed, noticing the nursing textbook that stuck out slightly from her apron pocket. Sandra's hand moved instinctively to push it further down, suddenly self-conscious about her dreams in front of this man who clearly had never wanted for anything. "Part-time student," Sandra said carefully, not wanting to explain how she squeezed in classes between double shifts and tried to study while Marcus passed out drunk on the couch. The less this stranger knew about her life, the better. Kim nodded slowly, like her answer had confirmed something he had already suspected. He drank his coffee in silence while Sandra attended to her other tables, but she could feel his attention on her like a physical weight. Every time she passed booth 7, his dark eyes tracked her movement with an intensity that made her increasingly nervous. When Sandra brought him his check, Kim laid $300 bills on the table without looking at the total. The check was for $3.50. "Sir, this is way too much," Sandra said, staring at the money in shock. $300 was more than she made in a week of tips combined. "Keep it," Kim said simply, standing from the booth in one fluid motion. "You earned it." Before Sandra could protest further, he was gone, disappearing through the diner's front door and into the Chicago night like he had never been there at all. Sandra stood holding the money, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to process what had just happened. $300 was enough to push her escape fund over the halfway mark. It was enough to buy textbooks for next semester. It was enough to matter in ways that this elegant stranger couldn't possibly understand. But as Sandra folded the bills carefully and slipped them into her apron pocket, she couldn't shake the feeling that the money came with strings attached. Men like that didn't give away $300 for a cup of black coffee without wanting something in return. The question was what he wanted, and whether Sandra was prepared to pay the price when he came to collect. As she cleaned booth 7, Sandra found herself looking toward the front door, half expecting to see the Korean man's silhouette against the glass. But the street outside remained empty, and Murphy's Diner settled back into its familiar rhythm of tired customers and mediocre coffee. Still, something had changed in those 20 minutes, something Sandra couldn't name, but could feel in the way her pulse hadn't quite returned to normal. She finished her shift 3 hours later, but the memory of dark, calculating eyes and $300 in unexpected generosity followed her home through the empty Chicago streets. Sandra Washington had no idea that her life had just been evaluated, measured, and found worthy of protection by one of the most dangerous men in the city. She only knew that for the first time in months, she felt like someone had actually seen her, not just the uniform and the smile she wore to survive. 3 days passed before Kim Hyung-nam returned to Murphy's Diner, but Sandra had thought about him every shift in between. The $300 sat in her secret savings, pushing her escape fund to $4,300, but the money felt different somehow, weighted with questions she couldn't answer. When he walked through the front door on Friday evening, Sandra's stomach clenched with a mixture of anticipation and dread that she couldn't quite explain. This time, Kim waited to be seated instead of choosing his own table. When Jenny, the evening hostess, approached him with menus, he spoke quietly and gestured towards Sandra's section. Sandra watched the exchange from behind the coffee station, noting how Jenny's demeanor shifted from casual friendliness to something more deferential, almost nervous. Whatever Kim had said, it had made an impression. "Your booth 7 is back," Jenny said when she reached Sandra, her voice carrying a note of curiosity. "Says he specifically wants your section. Must have liked your service last time." Sandra nodded, trying to keep her expression neutral as she gathered a menu and water glass. But her hands weren't quite steady, and she had to concentrate on not spilling as she made her way across the diner's worn linoleum floor. Kim sat in the same booth as before, but this time Sandra noticed details she had missed. The way he positioned himself with his back to the wall and clear sight lines to both the front door and the kitchen entrance. The way his hands rested on the table, relaxed but ready. This was a man who had learned to always be prepared for trouble. "Good evening," Sandra said, setting the water glass down carefully. She was acutely aware that tonight her makeup was heavier than usual, covering not just the fading bruise on her cheek, but the fresh mark on her temple where Marcus had grabbed her hair too hard during an argument about the electric bill. "Sandra," Kim said, and hearing her name in his precise, accented voice made her realize she had never told him what it was. The name tag on her uniform was turned around, hidden beneath her apron. He had asked someone, probably Jenny, and that small detail made Sandra's pulse quicken with unease. "You know my name," Sandra observed, trying to keep her tone light despite the wariness creeping up her spine. "I make it my business to know things that interest me," Kim replied simply, his dark eyes fixed on her face with that same intense focus she remembered from 3 days ago. Tonight, his study of her features felt even more deliberate, like he was cataloging changes, noting new details. "What can I get you tonight?" Sandra asked, falling back on professional routine because it was safer than trying to understand why this wealthy, dangerous-feeling stranger had taken an interest in a struggling diner waitress. "Coffee, black," Kim said, exactly as before. But he made no move to look at the menu, and Sandra had the distinct impression that coffee wasn't really why he was here. "I'll get that for you right away," Sandra said, turning to leave. But Kim's voice stopped her before she had taken 2 steps. "That's quite a bruise," he said quietly, his tone conversational, but his eyes sharp with something that might have been concern or calculation. Sandra's hand moved instinctively toward her temple before she could stop herself. The foundation there felt suddenly inadequate, like it was dissolving under his penetrating stare. "I'm clumsy," she replied automatically, the lie rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. "Always bumping into things." Kim's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his dark eyes, a recognition that made Sandra's stomach drop. "You must be very clumsy," he said, and the way he emphasized the word made it clear he didn't believe her explanation for even a second. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Sandra felt exposed, like this stranger could see through every carefully constructed wall she had built around her private pain. No one noticed the bruises anymore. Her coworkers had stopped asking questions months ago. Even her family had learned not to probe too deeply into her relationship with Marcus. But this man, this Kim Hyung-nam, had taken one look and seen exactly what she had been trying so hard to hide. "Things happen," Sandra said finally, her voice smaller than she intended. "People have accidents." "Do they?" Kim asked, and it wasn't really a question. His gaze moved from the barely concealed bruise on her temple to the way she favored her left arm, to the careful way she moved that suggested other injuries hidden beneath her uniform. "Some accidents are more deliberate than others." Sandra felt her breath catch in her throat. This was dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that could lead to questions she couldn't answer and interventions she couldn't afford. Marcus had made it very clear what would happen if she ever told anyone about their private business. But there was something about Kim's steady attention, his obvious intelligence, that made her feel like lying was pointless. "I should get your coffee," Sandra said, trying to end the conversation before it went any further. But as she turned away, Kim spoke again, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "When you're ready to stop handling it alone," he said, reaching into the inside pocket of his expensive jacket, "you call this number." Kim placed a business card on the table, sliding it across the surface until it rested near Sandra's hand. The card was heavy stock paper, cream-colored with simple black lettering. Kim Hyung-nam, and below that a phone number. No company name, no title, no indication of what business he was in that required such expensive clothing and allowed him to tip waitresses $300 for a cup of coffee. Sandra stared at the card, her mind racing. "Why would you help me?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Kim replied, his voice carrying a certainty that made Sandra believe he really did see more than she had realized. "I know you're intelligent. I know you work hard. I know someone is hurting you. And I know you deserve better than whatever situation has you counting bruises instead of blessings." The words hit Sandra like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. When was the last time someone had told her she deserved better? When was the last time someone had looked at her and seen potential instead of just another body to use up and throw away? "I have to get your coffee," Sandra whispered, her voice thick with emotions she couldn't afford to feel in the middle of Murphy's diner. But her hand moved almost without conscious thought, fingers brushing against the business card's smooth surface. "Take your time," Kim said, settling back in the booth like he was prepared to wait all evening if necessary. "I'm not going anywhere." Sandra walked to the coffee station on unsteady legs, her mind spinning with questions and possibilities. The business card felt like it was burning a hole in the table behind her, a lifeline thrown by a stranger who might be more dangerous than the situation she was trying to escape. But as she poured Kim's coffee, Sandra found herself thinking about $4,300 and how far that money could take her if she had someone powerful enough to ensure Marcus couldn't follow. When Sandra returned with the coffee, the business card was still on the table. Kim made no move to retrieve it, and Sandra made no move to touch it, but the small rectangle of paper seemed to dominate the space between them like a loaded weapon. "Let me ask you something," Kim said, lifting his coffee cup to his lips with those same economical, precise movements Sandra had noticed before. "If you could walk away from whatever is hurting you, walk away tonight and never look back, would you do it?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and impossible at the same time. Sandra thought about her secret savings, about the nursing school applications she had filled out but never submitted because she couldn't afford the tuition, about the dream she had shelved to survive Marcus's version of love. "It's not that simple," Sandra said finally. "It could be," Kim replied, and something in his tone suggested he had the resources to make good on that promise. Before Sandra could respond, the diner's front door opened with its familiar chime, and Marcus walked in. Sandra's blood turned cold as she recognized his swagger, the way he scanned the room until his eyes found her. Marcus was early tonight, which meant he was probably drunk, which meant trouble. "I have to go," Sandra said quickly, her voice tight with sudden fear. Marcus's gaze had already found Kim, and she could see the suspicion forming on her boyfriend's face as he took in the expensive suit and the intimate conversation. "Take the card," Kim said quietly, his own eyes tracking Marcus's approach with the kind of professional assessment that made Sandra wonder exactly what kind of business Kim Hyung-nam was really in. "I can't," Sandra whispered, but her hand was already moving, fingers closing around the business card just as Marcus reached their table. "Hey baby," Marcus said loudly, his voice carrying the slight slur that meant he had been drinking since he got off his construction job. His hand landed possessively on Sandra's shoulder, fingers digging in just hard enough to hurt without leaving marks. "Who's your friend?" "Just a customer," Sandra said quickly, slipping the business card into her apron pocket with movements she hoped Marcus couldn't see. Marcus's grip on her shoulder tightened, and Sandra fought not to wince. Kim stood from the booth in one fluid motion, and suddenly the dynamics of the situation shifted completely. Kim was tall, probably 6 feet, but it wasn't his height that made Marcus take an involuntary step backward. It was the way Kim carried himself, the absolute confidence that radiated from every line of his body, the sense that this was a man who had never backed down from anything in his life. "Enjoy your evening," Kim said politely, placing a $20 bill next to his barely touched coffee cup. But his dark eyes stayed fixed on Marcus's face, and Sandra had the distinct impression that Kim was memorizing every detail, cataloging information for reasons she didn't want to think about. "Yeah," Marcus said, his bravado faltering slightly under Kim's steady stare. "You too, man." Kim nodded once, then walked past them toward the front door. But as he passed Sandra, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "The offer stands." Then he was gone, disappearing into the Chicago night as quietly as he had appeared. Sandra watched through the diner's front window as a black sedan pulled up to the curb, expensive and sleek and completely out of place on this rundown street. Kim slid into the passenger seat, and the car disappeared into traffic, leaving Sandra alone with Marcus and a business card that felt like both a promise and a threat burning in her apron pocket. "Who the hell was that?" Marcus demanded, his grip on Sandra's shoulder shifting to something that would definitely leave marks. "Just a customer," Sandra repeated, but she could feel the business card's edges pressing against her hip, sharp and real and impossibly tempting. For the first time since she had started counting down the days until she could escape, Sandra wondered if maybe she didn't have to wait after all. The end came 3 days later when Marcus found the $4,300 hidden beneath the loose floorboards in Sandra's bedroom. She had been careless, too tired after a double shift to properly conceal the money, and Marcus had been suspicious ever since the night at the diner when he caught her talking to the Korean man in the expensive suit. Sandra was studying for her anatomy exam at the kitchen table when Marcus came out of the bedroom holding the stack of bills, his face twisted with the kind of rage that made her stomach drop and her body prepare for violence. She had seen this expression before, usually right before Marcus convinced himself that hitting her was justified, that whatever he was angry about was somehow her fault. "Where did you get this money, Sandra?" Marcus demanded, waving the cash in front of her face. His breath smelled like beer and cigarettes, and Sandra could see the vein pulsing in his temple that always appeared when he was building up to something ugly. "I've been saving tips," Sandra said quickly, closing her textbook and standing from the chair. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too cramped, with Marcus blocking the path to the front door. "It's just tip money, Marcus. I've been putting away a little each week." "Bullshit," Marcus spat, and Sandra flinched as drops of his saliva hit her cheek. "Waitresses at that shithole diner don't make this kind of money. This is over $4,000, Sandra. You trying to tell me you saved $4,000 from pouring coffee for truckers and construction workers?" Sandra's mind raced, trying to find an explanation that wouldn't make things worse. She couldn't tell him about Kim's $300 tip without admitting she had been hiding money from a strange man, which would only fuel Marcus's paranoia and possessiveness. But she also couldn't think of any other story that would explain the amount of cash she had managed to accumulate. "I work hard, Marcus," Sandra said, keeping her voice as calm and steady as possible. "I pick up extra shifts, I work holidays. The money adds up when you save it instead of spending it." "Don't lie to me," Marcus roared, and his hand shot out faster than Sandra could react, catching her across the face with enough force to send her stumbling backward into the kitchen counter. The edge of the countertop caught her ribs hard, driving the air from her lungs and sending sharp pain through her torso. Marcus grabbed her arm and spun her around to face him, his grip tight enough to leave bruises on her upper arm. His other hand tangled in her hair, pulling her head back at an angle that made her neck strain and her eyes water. "You're cheating on me, aren't you?" Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. "Some rich asshole is paying you for pussy, and you thought you could hide it from me. You thought you could save up enough money to leave me like I'm some kind of fool." "No, Marcus, I'm not cheating," Sandra gasped, trying to twist away from his grip without success. "It's just tips. I swear it's just tip money. I would never cheat on you." But even as she said the words, Sandra could see that Marcus had already decided what he believed. The paranoia and jealousy that had been building for months had finally found a target, and the evidence of her secret savings had given him all the justification he needed to unleash the violence that always simmered just beneath the surface of his personality. Marcus's fist connected with Sandra's stomach, doubling her over and driving what little air she had managed to recover from her lungs. She collapsed to the kitchen floor, gasping and retching, while Marcus stood over her with the money still clutched in his hand. "You think you can play me for a fool," Marcus continued, his voice rising to a shout. "You think you can whore yourself out behind my back and save up money to run away? Well, guess what, bitch? This money is mine now. And when I find out who's been paying you, I'm going to make him wish he never met you." Sandra curled into a ball on the cold linoleum, trying to protect her ribs and stomach from Marcus's kicks. But through the pain and fear, her mind fixed on one clear thought. Kim Hyung-nam's business card was in her purse, hanging on the chair just 3 feet away. "When you're ready to stop handling it alone," he had said, "the offer stands." Marcus dragged Sandra to her feet by her hair, and she bit back a scream as several strands pulled free from her scalp. His face was inches from hers, and she could see the alcohol-glazed fury in his eyes that meant he was past the point of reason or restraint. "You're not going anywhere, Sandra," Marcus said, his voice low and menacing. "You belong to me. This apartment, this money, your body, it's all mine. And if I find out you've been spreading your legs for someone else, I'm going to make sure you never walk again." Sandra nodded frantically, agreeing to anything that might make him stop hurting her. But as Marcus shoved her toward the bedroom, probably to continue the beating in private, Sandra caught sight of her purse hanging on the kitchen chair. Kim's business card was in the side pocket, along with her phone. If she could just reach it, if she could just make one phone call. Marcus pushed Sandra onto the bed and turned back toward the kitchen, probably to get another beer and decide how to spend her $4,000. This was her chance, maybe the only one she would get. Sandra rolled off the bed and crawled toward the bedroom door, her ribs screaming in protest with every movement. She could hear Marcus in the kitchen, slamming cabinet doors and muttering about lying whores and disrespectful women. Sandra pulled herself upright using the doorframe and lunged for her purse, grabbing it just as Marcus's voice echoed from the kitchen. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" he shouted, and Sandra could hear his heavy footsteps heading back toward the bedroom. With shaking hands, Sandra pulled out her phone and Kim's business card. She dialed the number, praying that he would answer, that the offer was real, that someone would care enough to help her before Marcus decided to finish what he had started. The phone rang once before Kim's voice came through the speaker, calm and controlled despite the late hour. "Sandra, help me," Sandra whispered into the phone, pressing herself against the bedroom wall as Marcus's footsteps grew closer. "Please, he's going to kill me." "Address," Kim said simply, no questions about who was threatening her or why she was calling. Sandra rattled off her apartment address just as Marcus appeared in the bedroom doorway, his face contorted with fresh rage at finding her with the phone. 20 minutes, Kim said, and the line went dead. Marcus lunged for the phone, but Sandra was already moving, adrenaline overriding the pain in her ribs as she dodged toward the window. She wasn't fast enough. Marcus caught her arm and spun her around, his hand already rising to strike. Then the front door exploded inward with a sound like thunder, and suddenly Marcus froze with his fist inches from Sandra's face. Heavy footsteps echoed through the apartment, multiple sets, moving with military precision. Kim Hyong-nam appeared in the bedroom doorway flanked by two men in dark suits who looked like they had stepped out of Sandra's worst nightmares. "Remove your hands from her," Kim said quietly, but his voice carried the kind of authority that made Marcus's hand drop to his side immediately. "Now step away." Marcus took 2 quick steps backward, his earlier rage evaporating into something that looked suspiciously like terror. The 2 men with Kim moved into the room, positioning themselves between Marcus and Sandra with practiced efficiency. Kim approached Sandra carefully, his dark eyes cataloging her injuries with clinical precision. His expensive suit was as immaculate as always, but there was something different about his demeanor tonight, something cold and dangerous that made the air in the room feel electric with potential violence. "Can you walk?" Kim asked Sandra, his voice gentle despite the fury she could see building behind his controlled expression. "I think so," Sandra whispered, testing her weight on her legs. Her ribs protested, and there was a sharp pain in her left side that suggested Marcus's kicks had done more damage than she initially realized. "Good," Kim said, then turned his attention to Marcus, who was pressed against the far wall like he was trying to disappear into the paint. "You have 10 seconds to pack whatever belongings you value and leave this city permanently." "Now wait just a minute," Marcus started, his voice cracking with fear and false bravado. "This is my apartment, and she's my girlfriend. You can't just come in here," and Kim held up one hand, and Marcus's words died in his throat. 5 seconds, Kim said calmly. "And if I see you again, if you contact her again, if you even think about her again, my associates will ensure that you regret every choice that led you to this moment." Marcus looked at the 2 men flanking Kim, taking in their expensive suits, their obvious physical conditioning. Their complete lack of expression that suggested violence was simply another tool in their professional arsenal. Whatever he saw convinced him that Kim's threat was not idle. Marcus grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and began throwing clothes into it with shaking hands. 2 minutes later, Marcus was gone, taking nothing but a bag of clothes and the terror that would probably keep him running for the rest of his life. Kim's associates swept the apartment efficiently, checking for any sign that Marcus might return or that other threats might be lurking. When they finished, they positioned themselves outside in the hallway, leaving Kim alone with Sandra. "We need to get you medical attention," Kim said, pulling out his phone. "I have a doctor who can see you privately, discreetly." Within an hour, Sandra found herself in the back of Kim's black sedan, her ribs wrapped in professional bandages, and her face cleaned of the blood that had been trickling from her split lip. The doctor, an older Korean man who asked no questions and accepted cash payment, had confirmed what Sandra already knew. Bruised ribs, minor head trauma, extensive bruising, but nothing permanently damaged. The sedan pulled up in front of a building that made Sandra's breath catch in her throat. Kim's penthouse was in one of Chicago's most exclusive high-rises, the kind of place Sandra had only seen in magazines. The doorman greeted Kim by name and gestured them toward a private elevator that required a special key to operate. When the elevator opened directly into Kim's apartment, Sandra stepped into a world that seemed to exist in a different universe from her cramped, run-down apartment with Marcus. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, and the furnishings were minimal but obviously expensive. Everything was clean lines and quality materials, leather and marble, and carefully chosen artwork that probably cost more than Sandra made in a year. "Sit," Kim said gently, gesturing to a leather sofa that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel. "Rest while I make some arrangements." Sandra sank into the sofa, her body finally able to relax now that she was safe, truly safe, for the first time in months. Kim disappeared into what she assumed was his office, and Sandra could hear him making phone calls in rapid Korean, his voice sharp with authority and command. When Kim returned 20 minutes later, he was carrying 2 cups of tea and wearing an expression that suggested he had made several important decisions. He handed Sandra one of the cups and settled into the chair across from her, his posture formal and businesslike. "I have a proposition for you, Sandra," Kim said, and something in his tone made Sandra understand that this was not a casual conversation. This was a negotiation that would determine the direction of her entire life. Sandra set down her teacup and focused on Kim's face, seeing nothing but sincerity and controlled intensity in his dark eyes. "I need someone with medical training to provide discreet healthcare services for my organization," Kim began, his voice measured and precise. "Someone intelligent, trustworthy, capable of keeping confidential information confidential. In exchange, I can offer you complete financial security, educational opportunities, and most importantly, permanent protection from anyone who might wish to harm you." Kim paused, studying Sandra's face for her reaction before continuing. "The financial terms are $100,000 per year, paid monthly. Full tuition for nursing school at the institution of your choice. A separate apartment for any family members you wish to relocate for their safety. Complete medical and dental coverage. Investment accounts established in your name." Sandra's mind struggled to process the numbers Kim was stating so casually. $100,000 was more money than she had ever dreamed of having. Full nursing school tuition would eliminate the debt that had been keeping her trapped in service jobs. An apartment for her grandmother and younger cousins would get them out of the dangerous neighborhood where they currently lived. "What would you expect in return?" Sandra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You would live here, in secured housing I will provide," Kim replied. "You would be available to treat injuries and illnesses for members of my organization, with complete discretion about the nature of their work. You would maintain absolute loyalty and silence regarding anything you observe or learn. And you would accept my protection, which means accepting certain restrictions on your freedom for your own safety." Kim leaned forward slightly, his expression serious and intent. "I want to be clear about the consequences of betrayal, Sandra. If you accept this arrangement and then violate it by revealing information or attempting to leave without permission, the results would be permanent and irreversible. This is not a temporary job or a casual agreement. This is a commitment that will define the rest of your life." Sandra stared at Kim, trying to understand exactly what he was offering and what he was asking for in return. She would be trading her independence for security, her freedom for protection, her old life for a future that was both golden and caged. "Why me?" Sandra asked finally. "You could hire any nurse, any medical professional. Why choose someone you met serving coffee in a diner?" "Because you proved yourself tonight," Kim replied. "When faced with violence, you didn't freeze. You acted. You called for help instead of suffering in silence. You showed intelligence under pressure and courage when it mattered. Those qualities are rare and valuable." Kim stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights below. "I also need someone who understands what it means to be powerless," he said quietly. Someone who appreciates the value of safety and security because they know what it's like to live without them. Someone who won't take protection for granted. Sandra looked around the luxurious apartment, thinking about her $4,000 savings that Marcus had stolen, her deferred nursing school applications, her grandmother's medical bills that kept piling up no matter how many extra shifts Sandra worked. She thought about the terror in Marcus's eyes when Kim had walked into that bedroom, the absolute authority in Kim's voice that had made a violent man back down without question. "What if I say no?" Sandra asked. "Then I will have you driven to a safe location of your choosing," Kim replied without hesitation. "I will ensure that Marcus never contacts you again, and I will pay for whatever medical treatment you need to recover from tonight's injuries. You would be free to rebuild your life however you choose. And if I say yes, then tomorrow your life begins again, but this time with resources and protection that will ensure you never have to count bruises or hide money or wonder if tonight is the night someone decides to kill you." Sandra closed her eyes, weighing the impossible choice Kim had laid before her. Freedom versus security. Independence versus protection. The unknown dangers of building a life alone versus the known constraints of accepting help from a man whose business required armed associates and doctors who didn't ask questions. When she opened her eyes, Kim was watching her with patient intensity, and Sandra realized that he already knew what her answer would be. He had read her situation perfectly, understood exactly how desperate and limited her options really were. This wasn't really a choice at all. This was salvation wrapped in terms that made it possible for her to accept without feeling like charity. "I accept," Sandra said, her voice clear and steady despite the magnitude of what she was agreeing to. Kim nodded once, satisfaction flickering briefly across his controlled features. "Welcome to your new life, Sandra Washington," he said simply. "Tomorrow we begin the process of ensuring that tonight was the last time anyone will ever hurt you." 3 months after that terrible night when Marcus had beaten her for the last time, Sandra Washington stood in the kitchen of Kim Hyungnam's penthouse, preparing medications for one of his associates who had suffered a knife wound during what Kim diplomatically referred to as a business disagreement. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating her workstation with its professional medical supplies and carefully organized pharmaceutical inventory. This was her life now, and the strange thing was how normal it had begun to feel. Sandra's daily routine had settled into a rhythm that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Mornings were for nursing school at Northwestern University, where Kim had enrolled her in an accelerated program that would have her licensed and certified within 18 months instead of the traditional 4 years. The tuition alone cost more than Sandra had made in 2 years at Murphy's Diner, but Kim paid it without question, along with her books, supplies, and even a laptop computer that was more advanced than anything Sandra had ever owned. Afternoons were for her medical duties within Kim's organization. She treated everything from minor cuts and bruises to more serious injuries that couldn't be handled at traditional hospitals without raising awkward questions. Kim's associates were unfailingly polite to her, addressing her as Miss Washington with a deference that had taken Sandra weeks to get used to. They understood that she was under Kim's personal protection and that disrespecting her would have consequences none of them wanted to face. Evenings belonged to Kim himself, and those were the hours that had surprised Sandra the most. She had expected her employer to be distant, formal, treating her like hired help who happened to live in his home. Instead, Kim had revealed himself to be unexpectedly domestic, cooking elaborate Korean meals that he insisted on sharing with her, asking about her classes and genuinely listening to her answers, discussing everything from current events to her dreams for the future. Tonight was no different. Sandra finished organizing her medical supplies and found Kim in the kitchen, sleeves of his expensive shirt rolled up, preparing what looked like enough food for 6 people instead of 2. The contrast still amazed her sometimes, seeing this man who commanded fear and respect from dangerous criminals carefully chopping vegetables with the precision of a professional chef. "How was school today?" Kim asked without looking up from his work, but Sandra could hear the genuine interest in his voice. He had been asking the same question every evening for 3 months, and he never seemed to grow tired of her answers. "Challenging," Sandra replied, settling onto one of the bar stools that lined the kitchen island. "We're studying trauma response and emergency medicine. Professor Chin says I have natural instincts for critical care." Kim glanced up at that, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I could have told her that, he said simply. You proved your instincts the first time you treated bullet wound for Jinho. Sandra remembered that night clearly. Jinho, one of Kim's senior lieutenants, had arrived at the penthouse bleeding heavily from a gunshot wound to his shoulder. Sandra had worked for 2 hours to stabilize him, removing the bullet and stitching the wound, while Kim watched silently from the corner. When she finished, Jinho had bowed deeply to her, speaking rapidly in Korean before Kim translated. He says you have the hands of a healer, Kim had told her that night. He says you saved his life, and now he owes you a debt that can never be repaid. The memory still gave Sandra a warm feeling of accomplishment and purpose. For the first time in her adult life, she was using her intelligence and skills for something that mattered, something that made a difference. Kim had given her not just safety and financial security, but the opportunity to become the person she had always dreamed of being. Your grandmother called this afternoon, Kim said, pulling Sandra from her memories. The new apartment is everything she hoped for. She wanted me to tell you that the view from her bedroom window overlooks the lake, and she can see the sunrise every morning. Sandra felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. Kim had moved her 70-year-old grandmother and her 2 teenage cousins out of the dangerous South Side neighborhood, where they had been struggling to survive. Now they lived in a secure, modern apartment in a safe area, with all their medical bills and living expenses covered. Her grandmother's diabetes medication, which had been rationed because of cost, was now delivered monthly without regard to price. She also said to tell you that Marcus came by the old neighborhood last week, looking for you. Kim continued, his voice careful and neutral. He seemed surprised to find that your family had moved without leaving any forwarding information. Sandra's blood chilled at the mention of Marcus's name. In the safety and luxury of Kim's world, she had almost managed to forget that her abusive ex-boyfriend was still out there, still potentially dangerous. What did he do? Sandra asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice. Nothing, Kim replied firmly. Because my people were watching, and they made it clear to him that his interest in your family's whereabouts was unwelcome. He won't be returning to that neighborhood, or any neighborhood where people you care about might be found. Sandra nodded, feeling the familiar comfort that came from knowing Kim's protection extended far beyond just her own safety. He had anticipated threats she hadn't even considered, put safeguards in place that ensured her loved ones were as secure as she was. Thank you, Sandra said quietly, the words feeling inadequate for the scope of what Kim had done for her and her family. Kim set down his knife and turned to face her fully, his dark eyes serious and intent. There is something I want to tell you, Sandra. Something I should have explained months ago about why your safety matters so much to me. Sandra felt her pulse quicken. In all their evening conversations, Kim had been careful to keep the focus on her life, her dreams, her adjustment to their arrangement. He rarely spoke about his own past or motivations beyond the professional requirements of their relationship. You don't have to explain anything, Sandra said quickly. You've already done more for me than I could ever repay. Yes, I do, Kim replied, moving around the kitchen island to take the stool beside her. Because you deserve to understand that this arrangement is not just business for me. It's personal in ways that go back long before we met. Kim was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the Chicago skyline through the windows. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of old pain that Sandra had never heard from him before. I had a younger sister, Kim said simply. Her name was Min Young, and she was everything good in a world that can be very dark. She was kind, trusting, always seeing the best in people even when they didn't deserve it. Sandra remained silent, sensing that this was a story Kim rarely told, if ever. Minyoung was 22 when she met a man named David Park. Kim continued. American-born Korean, very charming, seemed successful and stable. I was building my organization then, focused on establishing territory and eliminating competition. I was too busy securing my empire to pay attention to my sister's relationship. Kim's hands clenched into fists on the counter, and Sandra could see the tension in his shoulders that suggested this memory still caused him physical pain. David was charming in public and violent in private, Kim said, his voice growing colder. By the time I realized what was happening, Minyoung was too afraid to tell me the truth. She made excuses for her injuries, covered bruises with makeup, lied to protect a man who was slowly destroying her. Sandra's heart clenched with recognition and sympathy. She understood exactly what Kim's sister had experienced, the fear and shame that came with loving someone who hurt you. I found out the truth on a Tuesday morning when the police called to tell me they had found her body, Kim said, and his voice was barely above a whisper now. David had beaten her to death during an argument about money. My beautiful, innocent sister died alone and afraid while I was across town planning real estate acquisitions. The silence stretched between them, heavy with Kim's grief and guilt. Sandra reached out instinctively, covering his clenched fist with her smaller hand. It wasn't your fault, Sandra said gently. Yes, it was, Kim replied, his dark eyes meeting hers with brutal honesty. I had the resources to protect her, the power to eliminate any threat to her safety. But I was too focused on business to notice that my own sister was being murdered slowly, day by day, by someone who claimed to love her. Kim turned his hand palm up, allowing Sandra's fingers to intertwine with his. When I saw you that first night at the diner, covering bruises and making excuses for being clumsy, it was like seeing Min Young all over again, Kim said. Another beautiful, intelligent woman being destroyed by a man who didn't deserve to breathe the same air as her. Sandra felt tears running down her cheeks, understanding finally why Kim had taken such immediate and comprehensive action to ensure her safety. I couldn't save my sister, Kim continued, his voice rough with emotion. But I could save you. I could use everything I had built, all the power and resources that came too late for Min Young, to make sure that no one ever hurt you again. Sandra squeezed Kim's hand tighter, feeling the full weight of what he had given her. This wasn't just about business arrangements or medical services. This was about his attempt to heal an old wound, to honor his sister's memory by protecting another woman from the same fate. You did save me, Sandra said softly. You gave me everything I needed to rebuild my life. You gave me safety, opportunity, purpose. You gave me back my future. Kim lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to Sandra's knuckles. The gesture was tender and reverent, nothing like the possessive grabbing she had endured with Marcus. You saved me too, Kim said quietly. Taking care of you, watching you heal and grow stronger, it gives meaning to everything I built. You make me feel like maybe I'm not just a monster who failed the one person who mattered most. Without thinking, Sandra slid from her stool and moved closer to Kim, wrapping her arms around him in a gentle embrace. She could feel the tension in his powerful frame, the careful control he maintained even in this moment of vulnerability. You're not a monster, Sandra whispered against his shoulder. You're the man who saved my life and gave me a chance to become who I was always meant to be. Kim's arms closed around her carefully, like he was afraid she might break if he held too tightly. They stayed that way for several minutes, two people who had found healing in each other's protection and care. When they finally separated, Sandra looked into Kim's dark eyes and realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. This was no longer just an arrangement between employer and employee, protector and protected. This was something deeper, more personal, more permanent than either of them had planned. The Korean food Kim had been preparing was probably ruined by now, forgotten in the emotional weight of his confession. But Sandra didn't care about dinner anymore. She cared about the man who had shared his deepest pain with her, who had trusted her with the memory of his beloved sister and the guilt that had driven him to save Sandra's life. Thank you for telling me about Min Young, Sandra said softly. She sounds like she was an amazing person. She was, Kim agreed, his voice steady again, but his eyes still soft with remembered love. And she would have liked you very much, Sandra. She would have been proud to know that her story helped save someone else. As they stood together in Kim's kitchen, surrounded by the luxury and security he had built, Sandra felt something settle into place in her heart. This was home now, not just the penthouse, but this connection with Kim himself. He wasn't just her protector anymore. He was becoming something much more precious and dangerous. He was becoming the man she was falling in love with. Marcus Powell had been watching Kim Hyung-nam's building for 3 weeks, learning the routines, studying the security patterns, and feeding his rage with whiskey and increasingly dangerous company. The fury that had been building since that humiliating night when the Korean crime boss had run him out of his own apartment had crystallized into something cold and calculating. Marcus wasn't just angry anymore. He was planning revenge. The Southside Serpents weren't the kind of men Marcus would have associated with 6 months ago, but desperation had a way of changing a person's standards. They were violent, unpredictable, and they had their own reasons for wanting to hurt Kim Hyung-nam. When Marcus had approached them with information about Kim's personal weakness, they had listened with the kind of predatory interest that made Marcus's skin crawl even as he fed them details about Sandra's schedule and movements. That Korean piece of shit thinks he can come into our territory and take whatever he wants, Rico Valdez had said, the Serpent's lieutenant who had become Marcus's primary contact. Thinks his money and his suits make him untouchable. But every man has something he values more than his own life, and you just handed us exactly what that is. Marcus took another swig from the bottle of cheap bourbon that had become his constant companion since losing Sandra and her $4,000. He was living in a weekly motel now, doing day labor construction when he could find it, spending his nights planning how to make Kim Hyung-nam pay for destroying his life. The plan was simple in its cruelty. The Serpents would take Sandra, not to kill her, but to use her as leverage. They would make Kim choose between his territory and his woman, between his business interests and the nurse who had somehow become important enough for him to go to war over. Either Kim would back down and withdraw from Southside operations, or they would hurt Sandra in ways that would break the Korean crime boss's legendary self-control. Sandra felt the prickle of unease for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon as she left her advanced trauma care class at Northwestern University. Someone was watching her, she was sure of it, but when she turned to scan the campus quad behind her, she saw only the usual mix of students and faculty going about their daily routines. Still, the feeling persisted, an itch between her shoulder blades that made her walk faster toward the parking garage where Kim's driver waited with the armored sedan. The sensation of being followed continued for 3 days, subtle but persistent. Sandra mentioned it to Kim during one of their evening dinners, expecting him to reassure her that she was being paranoid, that the safety measures he had put in place were more than adequate. Instead, Kim set down his chopsticks and fixed her with the kind of intense attention she had learned meant he was shifting into his professional mode. "Describe exactly what you've been feeling," Kim said, his voice calm, but his dark eyes sharp with concern. Sandra told him about the sensation of being watched, the glimpses of the same dark sedan she thought she had seen multiple times, the feeling that someone was studying her movements and routines. As she spoke, she watched Kim's expression grow progressively more serious. "You should have told me immediately," Kim said when she finished. "Those instincts exist for a reason, Sandra. In my world, paranoia keeps people alive." Kim pulled out his phone and made a series of rapid calls in Korean, his voice sharp with authority. Sandra could hear him giving orders, repositioning security, implementing what sounded like emergency protocols. "You're not going to school tomorrow," Kim told her when he finished the calls, "or until we determine the nature and scope of the threat." "But I have an exam in emergency medicine," Sandra protested. "Professor Chin specifically said that missing this test would affect my final grade." "Your final grade won't matter if you're dead," Kim replied flatly, and something in his tone made Sandra realize this was not a discussion she was going to win. The attack came on Thursday morning despite all of Kim's precautions. Sandra had been growing restless after 2 days of confinement in the penthouse, and she had convinced Kim to let her attend what should have been a low-risk study group session in the university library. The session was scheduled for a private study room on the 4th floor, surrounded by other students and faculty, with Kim's security team positioned discreetly throughout the building. Sandra was reviewing trauma response protocols with 3 other nursing students when the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing the study room in dim red illumination, but Sandra's blood turned to ice as she heard the sounds of shouting and scuffling from the hallway outside. "Everyone stay calm," Sandra said automatically, her medical training taking over even as her mind screamed with terror. But her hand was already reaching for her phone, already dialing the number she had memorized for exactly this kind of emergency. Kim answered on the first ring. "Sandra." "They're here," Sandra whispered into the phone, trying to keep her voice steady for the sake of the other students who were looking at her with growing panic. "Library, 4th floor, study room 412. "Stay where you are," Kim commanded, his voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that had never failed to calm Sandra's fears. "Help is coming." But even as Kim spoke, Sandra could hear the study room door being tested from the outside. Someone was trying the handle, finding it locked, moving on to what sounded like more direct methods of entry. The door exploded inward with a crash that made all 4 nursing students scream in terror. 3 men in dark clothing rushed into the room, moving with military precision towards Sandra specifically. They weren't interested in the other students, didn't even glance at the 3 young women who pressed themselves against the far wall in terror. Sandra Washington, the leader said, and his voice carried a slight Spanish accent that made Sandra think of gang territories and drug violence. "You're coming with us." Sandra backed away from the approaching men, her phone still clutched in her hand, Kim's voice shouting her name through the speaker. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Sandra said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the terror that was making her heart race. "That's not really your choice," the man replied, pulling out a knife that gleamed wickedly in the emergency lighting. "Your boyfriend has something that belongs to us, and now we have something that belongs to him." The next 60 seconds happened with a speed and violence that Sandra's mind could barely process. The study room's windows exploded inward as black-clad figures rappelled through the glass, moving with lethal efficiency. Gunfire erupted in the hallway outside, sharp and immediate. The 3 men who had been advancing on Sandra spun to meet this new threat, but they were already too late. Kim Hyong-nam appeared in the doorway like something out of Sandra's darkest nightmares and most desperate prayers. His expensive suit was torn and dirty. There was blood on his hands and face that didn't appear to be his own, and his dark eyes held a cold fury that made Sandra understand exactly why people feared him. The fight that followed was brief and brutal. Kim's men moved through the study room with professional precision, neutralizing threats with a speed that left Sandra dizzy with shock. When the violence ended 30 seconds later, the 3 men who had come to kidnap her were no longer moving, and Kim was kneeling beside Sandra, where she had collapsed against the wall. "Are you hurt?" Kim asked, his hands moving over her body with gentle efficiency, checking for injuries while his eyes remained sharp and alert for additional threats. "No," Sandra whispered, then louder as the shock began to wear off. "No, I'm okay. They didn't touch me." Kim pulled Sandra against his chest, holding her tightly while his security team secured the area and dealt with the aftermath of what had clearly been a coordinated assault on the university. Sandra could hear sirens in the distance, but somehow she knew that by the time the police arrived, any evidence of what had really happened would be carefully managed. "It's over," Kim murmured against Sandra's hair, his voice rough with emotions she had never heard from him before. "They can't hurt you anymore. None of them can hurt you anymore." Later that evening, back in the safety of Kim's penthouse, Sandra learned exactly what her attempted kidnapping had cost the men who had orchestrated it. Marcus Powell was dead, along with 5 members of the Southside Serpents who had thought they could use Sandra as leverage against Kim Hyong-nam. The deaths had been swift and permanent, and they sent a message throughout Chicago's criminal underworld that would ensure Sandra's safety for years to come. "What did you do to them?" Sandra asked as she sat on Kim's sofa, wrapped in a soft blanket and nursing a cup of tea that was supposed to calm her shattered nerves. "I ensured they could never threaten you again," Kim replied simply, his own control restored to its usual perfect precision. "The Southside Serpents no longer exist as an organization. Marcus Powell no longer exists at all." Sandra stared at Kim, understanding fully for the first time what it meant to be under the protection of a man like him. The violence that had saved her life was the same violence that made him dangerous to cross, and she was only safe because she had become precious to someone who was capable of eliminating entire criminal organizations when they threatened what belonged to him. "You killed them because of me," Sandra said, and it wasn't really a question. "I eliminated a threat that endangered what I value most in this world," Kim corrected, moving to sit beside her on the sofa. "You're not just under my protection anymore, Sandra. You're not just an arrangement or an employee or someone I'm helping out of obligation to my sister's memory." Kim reached out to touch Sandra's face gently, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone where no bruises would ever appear again. "You're mine," Kim said simply, the words carrying a weight of possession and protection that made Sandra's breath catch in her throat. "Completely and absolutely mine. And I protect what's mine with everything I have, everything I am, and everything I can become." Sandra looked into Kim's dark eyes and saw not just the dangerous crime boss who had eliminated threats to her safety, but the man who had shared his pain about his sister, who cooked dinner for her every night, who asked about her classes and genuinely cared about her dreams and goals. "And you're mine," Sandra replied, the words coming from some deep place in her heart that had been growing stronger for months without her fully realizing it. "Your broken pieces and your beautiful control and your terrible tenderness. You're mine, Kim Hyung-nam." Kim's arms came around Sandra then, holding her with a careful strength that spoke of both possession and protection. As she settled against his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat, Sandra realized that she had stopped thinking about freedom or independence months ago. This was where she belonged, in the arms of the most dangerous man in Chicago, the man who would kill to keep her safe, and who had given her everything she needed to become who she was always meant to be. The outside world might never understand their arrangement, might question how a woman could love a man whose hands were stained with violence. But Sandra understood that Kim's darkness wasn't separate from his love for her. It was the source of it, the thing that made him capable of protecting her absolutely and completely. She was his, and he was hers, and tomorrow she would wake up in a world where no one would ever be foolish enough to threaten her again. The message Kim Hyung-nam sent to Chicago's criminal underworld was delivered not through words or warnings, but through a demonstration of power so absolute and public that it would be discussed in whispered conversations for years to come. 3 days after Sandra's attempted kidnapping, every major crime family, gang leader, and street-level criminal in the city woke up to discover that the rules of their world had fundamentally changed. The Southside Serpents hadn't just been eliminated. They had been erased so completely that it was as if they had never existed at all. Their territory, their operations, their assets, everything had been absorbed into Kim's organization overnight with such surgical precision that even the police were baffled by how an entire criminal enterprise could simply vanish without a trace. But Kim wasn't finished sending his message. On Friday morning, every major newspaper in Chicago carried the same headline: Korean Business Consortium announces major Southside investment initiative. The story detailed how Kim Hyung-nam's legitimate business empire had purchased 12 blocks of property in what had formerly been gang territory, with plans to develop affordable housing, medical clinics, and community centers. The investment was worth $50 million, and it included full funding for a state-of-the-art emergency medical facility that would serve the underserved communities of Chicago's South Side. What the newspapers didn't report, but what every criminal in the city understood perfectly, was that Kim had just demonstrated his ability to not only destroy his enemies, but to remake entire neighborhoods according to his will. He hadn't just eliminated the Southside Serpents. He had taken their territory and transformed it into something that would improve thousands of lives while generating legitimate profit for his organization. Sandra read about the investment initiative over breakfast, studying the architectural renderings of the proposed medical facility, while Kim sat across from her drinking coffee and reading financial reports as if he hadn't just stunned the entire city with a display of power that redefined what it meant to be untouchable. "This medical center," Sandra said, pointing to the newspaper article. "It says here that it will specialize in trauma care and emergency medicine." Kim looked up from his reports with the small smile Sandra had learned meant he was particularly pleased with himself. "It will need a director of emergency services," he said casually. "Someone with advanced training in trauma response and crisis medicine. Someone who understands the unique medical needs of urban communities." Sandra stared at him, understanding slowly dawning. "You're offering me a job running a hospital. I'm offering you the opportunity to heal people on a scale that matches your capabilities," Kim replied. "The facility will be yours to design and operate according to your vision. Unlimited budget, cutting-edge equipment, the best staff money can hire. A chance to save lives professionally while continuing to save lives personally within our organization." Sandra felt tears prick at her eyes as the magnitude of what Kim was offering sank in. This wasn't just about providing her with a job or even a career. This was about giving her the platform to become everything she had ever dreamed of being, to use her medical skills to make a real difference in the world while remaining safely within Kim's protection. "Why?" Sandra asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "Because you deserve to have your dreams realized on the grandest scale possible," Kim said simply. Because I have the resources to make those dreams come true, and because watching you save lives gives meaning to everything I've built. 2 weeks later, Sandra Washington graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern University's Accelerated Nursing Program, finishing her degree in record time with grades that earned her recognition as the most promising emergency medicine specialist in her class. Kim sat in the front row of the graduation ceremony, his presence causing a stir among the other families as they tried to place the elegantly dressed Korean man who watched Sandra receive her diploma with obvious pride and satisfaction. After the ceremony, Kim's surprise continued. Instead of returning to the penthouse, they drove to a private airfield where Kim's personal jet waited to take them to Los Angeles for what he described as a celebration dinner. But as they flew over the country Sandra had never seen from this height, Kim's conversation took a direction that made her pulse quicken with anticipation and nervousness. There are traditions in my family, Sandra, Kim said as they shared champagne at 30,000 feet above the American heartland. Customs that have been observed for generations when a man finds a woman worthy of sharing his life permanently. Sandra set down her champagne glass, understanding that this conversation was about more than travel plans or celebration dinners. My grandmother lives in Los Angeles now, Kim continued, his voice carrying a formal tone Sandra had never heard before. She is the matriarch of our family, the keeper of our traditions, and her approval is necessary for certain decisions that affect the future of our bloodline. Kim reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box that made Sandra's breath catch in her throat. Inside was a ring unlike anything she had ever seen, a massive diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the airplane's cabin lights and threw rainbows across the walls. This belonged to my mother, and her mother before her, Kim said, his voice thick with emotion. It has been waiting for the woman who would become the next matriarch of the Kim family, the woman who would stand beside me not just as my partner, but as the mother of my children and the guardian of our future. Sandra stared at the ring, understanding that Kim was offering her more than just marriage. He was offering her a place in a legacy that stretched back generations, a role that would make her not just his wife, but the female head of a powerful family dynasty. Kim Hyung Nam, Sandra said softly, are you proposing to me at 30,000 feet? I'm asking you to be my wife, my partner, the mother of my children, and the corollary of everything I've built, Kim replied, his dark eyes serious and intent. I'm asking you to let me spend the rest of my life protecting you, providing for you, and watching you save lives on a scale that will change the world. Kim took the ring from the box and held it out to Sandra, his hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. I'm asking you to marry me, Sandra Washington, and to let me show you every day for the rest of our lives how precious you are to me. Sandra looked at the ring, then at Kim's face, seeing not just the dangerous crime boss who had eliminated threats to her safety, but the man who had shared his deepest pain with her, who had given her family security and safety, who had made her dreams possible on a scale she had never imagined. Yes, Sandra said simply, extending her left hand toward Kim. Yes to all of it. The marriage, the partnership, the family, the future. Yes to spending my life with the most dangerous and tender man I've ever known. As Kim slipped the ring on his Sandra's finger, she felt the weight of it both literally and figuratively. This wasn't just jewelry. It was a symbol of her transformation from abused waitress to the wife of one of the most powerful men in America, from victim to protector, from dreamer to someone who had the resources to make dreams come true for herself and others. The wedding took place 6 months later in a private ceremony that brought together Kim's Korean family traditions with elements that honored Sandra's African-American heritage. The guest list included legitimate business leaders, political figures, and others whose presence sent a clear message about Kim's place in both the criminal and legitimate power structures of American society. But for Sandra, the most meaningful moment came not during the elaborate ceremony, but afterward, when she and Kim were alone in the penthouse that was now officially their home. Kim had changed out of his formal wedding attire into a simple black shirt and pants, but he still wore the expression of deep satisfaction that had been on his face throughout the day. How does it feel? Sandra asked, settling beside him on the sofa where they had shared so many evening conversations, to have a wife who knows exactly what kind of man she married. Like coming home, Kim replied, pulling Sandra against his side with the careful tenderness that had characterized his touch from the very beginning. Like finding the missing piece that makes everything else meaningful. Sandra looked around the penthouse that was now legally hers as much as Kim's, thinking about the journey that had brought her from Murphy's diner to this moment. The scared, bruised waitress who had hidden money under floorboards seemed like someone from another lifetime. Someone Sandra could barely remember being. What happened to that girl? Sandra mused aloud, thinking about the woman she used to be. She grew into the woman she was always meant to be. Kim replied, his voice carrying absolute conviction. She just needed someone with the resources and determination to help her realize her potential. 6 months after their wedding, the Kim Family Medical Center opened its doors in what had once been Southside Serpents territory. Dr. Sandra Kim, as she was now known professionally, cut the ribbon at the opening ceremony while her husband stood beside her, his presence ensuring that no one would ever question her authority or challenge her decisions. The medical center became a model for urban healthcare, providing emergency services, trauma care, and community medicine to populations that had been underserved for generations. Sandra's reputation as both a healer and the wife of Kim Hyung-nam created a unique dynamic where gang members, businessmen, politicians, and ordinary citizens all received the same quality of care without fear or prejudice. But perhaps more importantly, the medical center served as a symbol of Sandra's complete transformation. The woman who had once hidden bruises behind makeup now commanded operating rooms where she saved lives daily. The woman who had counted tips to build an escape fund now managed budgets in the millions of dollars. The woman who had been afraid to dream now made other people's dreams possible through the Kim Family Foundation's scholarship and community development programs. On a quiet Tuesday evening, almost exactly 2 years after their first meeting at Murphy's Diner, Sandra and Kim stood together in the penthouse kitchen preparing dinner as they had done hundreds of times before. But tonight felt different, weighted with an announcement Sandra had been planning for weeks. "I have something to tell you," Sandra said, watching Kim's reflection in the kitchen window as he chopped vegetables with his usual precise efficiency. Kim set down his knife and turned to face her fully, his dark eyes immediately alert to the significance in her tone. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant," Sandra said simply, watching as comprehension dawned on Kim's face, followed immediately by an expression of joy so pure and overwhelming that it took her breath away. For a moment, Kim was completely still, as if processing information too important to rush. Then he crossed the kitchen in 2 quick steps and lifted Sandra off her feet, spinning her around with careful exuberance before setting her down and dropping to his knees to place both hands on her still flat stomach. "My child," Kim said softly, speaking to the life growing inside Sandra with the same reverent tone he used when discussing his sister's memory or his family's traditions. "My son or daughter, the next generation of our family." Kim looked up at Sandra, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for giving me everything I never knew I needed." As Sandra looked down at her husband, seeing the dangerous crime boss transformed into a man overwhelmed with anticipation of fatherhood, she thought about the impossible journey that had brought them to this moment. She had walked into Murphy's Diner as a victim, counting dollars toward freedom that felt impossibly distant. She had walked out of that life and into this one, where freedom meant something entirely different. Now she stood in a kitchen that cost more than most people's homes, married to a man whose protection ensured she would never be vulnerable again, pregnant with a child who would grow up knowing nothing but safety and opportunity and unconditional love. She had become not just Kim's wife, but his equal partner in building a legacy that would outlast both of them. The bruised waitress who had served coffee to dangerous men was gone forever, replaced by Dr. Sandra Kim, Director of Emergency Services, wife of Kim Hyung-nam, and soon-to-be mother to the next generation of a family dynasty built on loyalty, protection, and the absolute conviction that some people are worth any price to keep safe. "What do you think people would say?" Sandra asked as Kim stood and pulled her into his arms. "If they knew the real story of how we met. That sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most broken people finding exactly what they need to heal," Kim replied, his voice carrying the certainty that had drawn Sandra to him from the very beginning. As they stood together in the kitchen where Kim had first shared his sister's story, Sandra realized that her transformation was complete. She was no longer running from anything or counting down to escape. She was exactly where she belonged, in the arms of the most dangerous and devoted man she had ever known, building a future that would honor both their pasts and exceed every dream either of them had ever dared to imagine. How much do you think one life can change? And what are some signs that you've found the person who will change everything for you? Let me know in the comments below what you think about Sandra and Kim's story. Outside the penthouse windows, the lights of Chicago spread out like stars, and somewhere in the city, a new medical center saved lives every day under the direction of a woman who had learned that sometimes the greatest strength comes from accepting protection from someone powerful enough to ensure you never have to be afraid again.